Think about how we live now, connected globally, where ideas and goods move at lightning speed. Medieval Asia built many of the networks that later made global exchange possible. And here's the twist: you'll see why paper, gunpowder, and ships mattered as much as armies in shaping the world. If you're curious, stay with me. We'll move through the land routes, the empires that stretched them, the seas that carried them further, and the cultural and religious threads that bound it all together. These networks connected China, India, Central Asia, the Middle East, and beyond. The first step is to trace the lines themselves, the roads that wove a continent. What if the most important features on a medieval map were not the grand cities, but the thin lines threading between them? Those lines were the Silk Roads. They didn't just connect points on a page. Like blood vessels through a body, they carried lifeblood, goods, skills, and beliefs across vast distances in ways no single kingdom could contain. It's easy to picture camels loaded with silk heading for royal courts. That image catches part of the truth, but it leaves out the real variety of cargo. Merchants also brought paper, a material that enabled many states to expand their record keeping more cheaply and efficiently. They transported gunpowder, first developed in medieval China, which began to reshape how conflicts were fought. And in their packs were bundles of writings, spreading scriptures and scholarship that could change how societies thought about faith and knowledge. Centuries before Gutenberg's press revolutionized Europe, Chinese printing technologies developed during the medieval era were already spreading. Movable wooden or clay blocks could be arranged to produce entire pages quickly. Imagine a community that once relied on slow hand copying, suddenly able to share calendars, poems, or sacred texts far more widely. That transformation wasn't an accident. Caravans carried both the tools and the know-how that made such reproduction possible, sharing skills across cultural and political borders. Religious traditions also followed the same paths. A monk from India might walk the same dusty road as a Persian trader, and with them flowed new ideas. Buddhism traveled steadily into China, where it met Taoism and Confucianism, and from that fusion arose Chan, later known in Japan as Zen. Islam likewise moved along these commercial trails, not only through conquest, but also by way of merchants who settled near caravan hubs. Without printing presses or electronic networks, teachings still passed hand-to-hand through talks, rituals, and shared texts, in stopover inns and small markets. In other words, the Silk Roads were never only about trade goods. You can think of them as a kind of early internet. Each caravan was like a packet of information. These packets carried cloth and spices, but also songs, rituals, farming methods, and new styles of writing. When they passed through cities such as Samarkand or Chang'an and out again to smaller towns, they left connections that outgrew the simple picture of a silk market. But traffic along these arteries came with risk. Alongside profitable cargo came outbreaks of disease. The bubonic plague, which devastated Europe later, moved through parts of Asia first and traveled west along these networks. Traders who welcomed distant merchandise sometimes carried home pathogens as well. In short, trade helped move not only goods, but also microbes, and evidence links these routes to epidemics that reshaped entire societies. This darkest side of connection reminds you how deeply movement alone could alter history. What this shows is that the power of the Silk Roads lay not so much in the individual items carried, but in the constant flow itself. Goods enriched rulers, tools made daily work faster, fates crossed languages and found new forms. Even disease forced communities to adapt to crises. The lines themselves mattered more than any one city or empire, because they tied people together into webs of exchange, both fragile and enduring. Still, those webs of roads did not exist in isolation. Beyond the merchants and monks, they were entire powers that shaped the safety, speed, and reach of movement across continents. To understand how these routes thickened into even broader corridors of exchange, you need to look at the empires that rose to command them. What empire managed to span from the edges of Europe all the way to China, long before modern borders and passports existed? The answer is the Mongol Empire, forged under Genghis Khan and his successors. In broad terms, no other single power commanded such a vast, continuous landmass. Yes, their conquest could be brutally destructive, yet after that wave of violence, a system of order and protection facilitated unprecedented long-distance movement. Once the initial campaigns ended, the Mongols began building structures of control that made travel more possible than before. They set up relay stations across their lands and moved skilled artisans and officials where they were needed most. This was not about charity, it was about maintaining control. But the effect was clear. Communications sped up, administration stretched further, and new ideas rode along with goods and messengers. Their network worked like a medieval logistics chain, holding together a landmass larger than any empire before it. The empire also managed movement on a human scale. Entire groups of workers were uprooted from one corner of Eurasia and resettled elsewhere. Craftsmen, doctors, administrators, and storytellers were shifted into regions where their skills answered imperial needs. For the people moved, this could be harsh. Yet the result was that knowledge itself traveled. Techniques of weaving, medical practices, and methods of record-keeping mixed across borders. In that sense, the Mongols turned talent into a resource as valuable as silver or silk. Consider Marco Polo's stories. When he returned to Europe, he wrote of Yuan China's wealth and order in ways that astonished his readers. Historians debate how literally to take Marco Polo's account. Yet his book did reshape European imaginations about life under the Mongols. For many who had never seen maps of Asia, his descriptions opened the idea that worlds existed far beyond familiar coasts. Whether believed in full or dismissed as exaggerated, the fact remains that his writing moved vision and ambition across continents just as caravans carried physical goods. The Mongol achievement lay not only in fighting but in managing movement. They maintained broad lanes of passage like colossal highways across climates and languages. Guards and toll stations ensured safety while collecting revenue. Merchants who once feared attacks now had at least some guarantee of protection, even as they handed over payments to use the road. The empire profited, caravans profited, and circulation widened. In broad terms, this was a rare moment when the pace of pony hooves mirrored the pace of information and goods. What this shows is that Mongol power was both destructive and integrative. Armies swept through cities and erased rivals, yet those same armies enforced order that let trade and culture travel faster than before. Along those corridors, goods found new markets. Clerics built new communities, and languages entered households that had never heard them prior. The Mongols demonstrated that sheer force could create not just submission, but a framework for exchange. In other words, knowledge often outlived conquest. Weaving and scripts, medicines and chants, legal practices and tales, they all moved along channels carved by armies, but sustained by stability. And that created an effect few expected. Knowledge often outlasted fear and settled into courts, crafts, and languages that continued long after the writers were gone. We'll see examples of how this legacy changed cultures next. Still, not all great movements in this era were tied to horses or inland highways. While the Mongols knit together the continent's interior, another network was carrying wealth and stories across vast distances, this time not over land, but on water. What if global history was shaped as much by the sail of a ship as by the march of an army? Indian Ocean routes worked like liquid highways, carrying vessels that linked East Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and China. These weren't side notes to the land routes. They were fully developed systems with their own rhythms, dangers, and rewards. The Indian Ocean basin stretched from the Arabian Peninsula eastward to the Spice Islands of Southeast Asia. Along its coasts sat harbors alive with exchange. At a single dock, you might hear 5 different languages in one afternoon. Ships from Arabia unloaded dates and carpets. Vessels from China brought porcelain and tea. Local markets added pepper, rice, and finely woven cloth. Every port functioned as a hub where cargo, customs, and voices mixed in ways that reshaped everyday life. Here's a puzzle worth asking. Why do you often picture caravans before ships when thinking about medieval exchange? In part, it's because overland travel generated more famous travelogues. But maritime trade was enormous in its own right. Ships carried bulk cargo in quantities that no caravan could equal. From tons of pepper to bales of textiles, and sailors planned around the monsoon seasons, which cycled predictably enough to make long voyages reliable year after year. That regularity turned the ocean into an engine of commerce. Of course, sea lanes held their own dangers. Storms, piracy, and the uncertainty of seasonal winds meant every voyage carried risk. But when successful, they enabled contact on a scale unlike anything on land. Ports kept growing because entire shiploads, rather than camel loads, could arrive in a single day. One vivid example comes from the early Ming Dynasty. Between about 1403 and 1433, Admiral Zheng He led grand fleets across the Indian Ocean under the Mongol Emperor's command. His sailors reached as far as the coast of East Africa. Imagine whole squadrons of towering wooden ships arriving offshore, crowded with hundreds of crew bearing silks, ceramics, and court officials. These journeys were about more than trade. They projected state power across thousands of miles, signaling that China's influence extended overseas as well as land. Most maritime exchange, though, was more ordinary in scale. Islands sent nutmegs and cloves to mainland ports. South Indian cloth moved east. Gems and aromatics sailed west. What also traveled were skills and designs, navigation methods, shipbuilding tricks, decorative patterns. When you notice that a motif in one region echoes a style far away, chances are merchants at sea carried both the goods and the ideas. Belief also moved along these waters. Muslim merchants in particular established communities along India's and Southeast Asia's coasts. They didn't only trade, they built mosques and schools. These became anchors of connection, bringing together Islamic practice with local traditions. Over time, music, architecture, and daily rituals carried blended elements. Hindu and Buddhist traders also played roles, adding to a cultural mix that layered coastal towns with multiple identities. Ports became not only commercial centers, but crossroads of faith and custom. You can think of the oceans as roads made of water, directed by winds, instead of paving stones. They were less predictable than overland tracks, yet capable of moving whole worlds of cargo and culture in a single voyage. What this shows is that maritime networks deepened the story of connection. Trade didn't stop at borders. It stretched outward into seas where languages crossed, faiths blended, and rulers extended their reach. These ports and voyages shaped as much of Asia's cultural fabric as the land roads did. And to fully see how, you need to look at the beliefs, authorities, and warrior traditions that gave those exchanges weight in daily life. Warriors, thinkers, and faiths. How did warriors, philosophers, and religions shape daily life across medieval Asia? These weren't abstract ideas or distant figures. They were the frameworks through which people explained loyalty, organized power, and searched for meaning. Let's explore how that looked. First, China. During the Tang Dynasty, rulers managed not only territory but also a cultural synthesis of thought. Confucianism provided tools for training bureaucrats, while Taoism offered mystical traditions, and Buddhism brought from India open new paths of meditation and inner reflection. The Tang court supported this three-part system. One important outcome was the rise of Chan Buddhism, later known as Zen, with its emphasis on direct insight and mindful living over ritual repetition. Empress Wu Zetian even promoted Buddhism as a way to strengthen her own legitimacy, something highly unusual for a female ruler. But that support sparked resistance. Confucian officials complained of the financial strain, and Taoists warned that Buddhist temples absorbed too much influence. So instead of one victor, the Tang wove together multiple traditions into a layered religious and political fabric. With the Song dynasty, the balance tilted again. Neo-Confucian scholars reasserted themselves, arguing for a stricter return to hierarchy and moral order. Education and bureaucracy became even more central to ruling the state. This was when scholar officials gained status above aristocrats and monks. Social practices reflected those values. Foot binding spread widely as an outward marker of refinement and rank, embedding ideas of control directly onto the body. Song society, in other words, used Confucian frameworks both to structure government and to enforce sharp social boundaries. Next, Japan. Warrior traditions there were forming under different pressures. At their beginnings, samurais were not heroic knights but administrative helpers, local attendants who collected taxes, wrote records, and kept order for noble families. Over time, they expanded into armed retainers, valued by regional lords for their service in both politics and combat. The picture of a samurai bound to an ancient, rigid Bushido code is mostly a later creation. In the medieval period, their lives were fluid. Many acted like mercenaries, shifting allegiances as power shifted. Ronin masterless samurai often drifted between employment and lawless acts. Only in later centuries was Bushido reinterpreted as an unwavering code of loyalty and acceptance of death. Research makes clear the myth solidified later, while the reality in this earlier period was far more flexible and fragmented. Finally, India. By the 1200s, Islamic rulers had established the Delhi Sultanate, introducing both cavalry-based armies and new religious communities. Their forces helped hold back Mongol invasions while also expanding Islamic presence across the subcontinent. Yet Islam did not only spread through conquests, it also traveled through merchants who founded trading towns on India's coasts, where mosques and schools became local fixtures. Encounters with Hindu traditions produced cultural expressions rather than erasure. Architecture blended Persian arches with Sanskrit motifs. Poets wrote verses that tied ideas from both religions into shared imagery. For ordinary people, traces of this mixing appeared in crafts, music, and even festivals. Mixing, not replacement, is the pattern. What this shows is that warriors, thinkers, and faiths mattered as much as roads and ships. Confucian scholars reviewed candidates for government service. Buddhist monks shaped questions of meaning. Taoist sages emphasized harmony with nature. In Japan, warriors balanced practical service with shifting codes of honor. In South Asia, Islamic and Hindu traditions stood side by side, sometimes clashing, sometimes merging. Across the continent, people lived in worlds where power and belief constantly reinforced or challenged one another. We've seen trade and force both move ideas, so which mattered more in reshaping everyday life? The answer will surprise you, because once you bring these threads together, you begin to see that the medieval world was already operating on a global scale. Its exchanges leaving marks far beyond gold or spices, and that wider fabric of connection is where we will turn next. Asia in the medieval age was defined not by isolation but by connection. Goods, people, beliefs, and even risks moved along steppe roads, desert paths, and coastal ports, binding distant regions into one big web of exchange. That constant movement shaped the world in ways that still echo today. In broad terms, these networks were foundational to later globalization. They show how trade, faith, tools, and warfare built shared systems across continents. Quick note, sources are listed below if you want to dig deeper. If you found this reframing useful, subscribe for more deep dives into medieval life. Next time you scroll a map or see goods in a store, you might spot the medieval threads that made them possible.